Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths by Mariana Mazzucato. Narrated by Callie Beaulieu. Forward to the 2018 edition, Rediscovering Public Wealth Creation. I wrote The Entrepreneurial State in 2013 to combat the view that in order to restore growth after the 2008 financial crisis, all that was needed was to reduce deficits by cutting public spending. Besides reminding listeners that the financial crisis was caused by private debt, not public debt, I argued that it was futile for countries to think they could cut their way to growth, given that a key driver of economic growth has been public investment in areas like education, research, and technological change. Indeed, one of the key lessons in the book is that without strategic public investments, we would not have any of the technologies in our smart products from the Internet to GPS and Siri. We would also not have the renewable energy solutions that might create a green revolution or most of the radical new drugs to treat diseases. In all these examples, public funds provided the patience and the long-term strategy before business was willing to invest. A greater understanding is thus needed about how to turn this potential capacity of the state as investor of first resort into a key driver of investment-led growth that can help tackle, alongside the private sector, the grand challenges of our time, from climate change to the future of healthcare to shaping the digital revolution. In other words, the book's purpose is to reframe the debate about the state's role in the economy away from ideology and towards practical thinking that can steer economies in ways that addresses societal and technological challenges ahead. The new edition is more relevant now than ever. The U.S. entrepreneurial state is under threat. Even Ronald Reagan, an advocate of downsizing the state, increased funding for the organizations that were key to innovation in pharmaceuticals, informatics, and energy. Today, such organizations are in constant need to defend themselves, not only from downsizing, but from having ambition beyond investing in patchy areas that might facilitate business. Among those in peril is the National Institutes of Health, NIH, which has been responsible for a large percentage of the most radical new drugs on the market, and the U.S. Advanced Research Projects Agency, Energy, ARPA-E, the innovation agency inside the Department of Energy and a sister organization of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, in the Department of Defense. It is indeed curious that the attack on ARPA-E, which is today trying to help lead energy innovation as DARPA-led IT innovation, was one of the first things Donald Trump decided to undertake. Under Trump's first budget proposal, ARPA-E was due to be slashed, but ended up being saved at the last minute. In 2018, it is again under threat, with its $305 million from the DOE's budget under threat and plans to ensure full closure of ARPA-E by mid-2020. While ARPA-E has proven able to take very early-stage risks before the private sector is willing, it is being accused of the opposite. There has been concern about the potential for ARPA-E's efforts to overlap with research and development, R&D, being carried out, or which should be carried out, by the private sector. This attack on the very essence and role of public organizations in leading societal and economic change means that the progressive agenda cannot be just about increasing public spending and the fight against austerity. It must also, and especially, be about safeguarding the structures and organizations that have taken time to build and are used to invest in the technology, infrastructure, and services needed for society to work better, to be more sustainable, inclusive, and innovative. While finance for budgets may come and go when organizations are dismantled, they can take decades to reconstruct. This applies equally to organizations that aim to create public value in the areas of modern green transport, next-generation internet, health innovation, or broadcasting. As argued in the book, the spiritual fathers of creative thinking in the public sector include John Maynard Keynes and Karl Polanyi. Keynes called on policymakers to think not just about counter-cyclical spending, but also to think big. In other words, government should not just dig ditches on shovel-ready projects, but think strategically about how investments can help shape citizens' long-term prospects. The economic historian Polanyi went even further in his classic book, The Great Transformation, in which he argued that free markets themselves are products of state intervention. In other words, markets are not freestanding realms in which states can intervene for good or ill. Rather, they are outcomes of public as well as private action. Businesses that make investment decisions and anticipate the emergence of new markets understand the need to think outside the box. Top managers, many of whom see themselves as wealth creators, take courses in decision sciences, strategic management, and organizational behavior. They are encouraged to take risks and to fight against inertia. But if value is created collectively, then those who pursue a career in the public sector should also be taught how to think outside the box and how to be entrepreneurial. But they aren't. Instead, public policymakers and civil servants are not regarded as wealth or market creators, but at best as mere market fixers, enablers and de-riskers, and at worst as impediments to wealth creation. This difference in conception is partly the result of mainstream economic theory, which holds that government should intervene only in cases of market failure. The state's role is to establish and enforce the rules of the game, level the playing field, fund public goods such as infrastructure, defense, and basic research, and devise mechanisms to mitigate negative externalities such as pollution. When states intervene in ways that exceed the mandate to correct market failures, they are often accused of creating market distortions, such as picking winners or crowding out the private sector. Moreover, the emergence of new public management theory, which grew out of public choice theory in the 1980s, led civil servants to believe that they should take up as little space as possible, fearing that government failures may be even worse than market failures, and hence abide by a culture of restraint. This thinking has caused many governments to adapt accounting mechanisms from the private sector, such as cost-benefit analysis, or to outsource functions to the private sector altogether, all in the name of achieving efficiency. Not only is there evidence that outsourcing and privatization more often than not don't lead to greater quality or efficiency, but these trends have undermined confidence in public institutions and have left them ill-equipped to work with businesses to confront 21st century challenges such as climate change and healthcare provision for an aging population. It was not always like this. In the post-war period, 2 U.S. government agencies, NASA and DARPA, created what would later become the Internet. Both agencies, founded in the 1950s, were given ample funding and clear goals. Their mission-oriented approach allowed them to attract top talent, and their staff were told to think big and take risks. Similarly, ARPA-E, set up in 2009, has been responsible for significant innovations in the field of renewable energy, particularly in battery storage, and the NIH has funded for decades the development of many blockbuster drugs. Rather than learning from the experiences of these programs, especially on how to use policy for tackling societal problems while also nurturing bottom-up experimentation and learning, the opposite is happening. This rich history is forgotten, and mission-oriented public institutions are being weakened. NASA increasingly must justify its existence in terms of immediate economic value rather than the pursuit of bold missions. The BBC is evaluated according to increasingly narrow metrics that are able to justify investments in high-quality news and documentaries, but unable to measure the ambition and success underlying the BBC's key accomplishment, public value creation independent of the format. The creation of public value cannot be simply correcting problems or filling gaps caused by business. Public value can and must become more of an objective in itself, concrete outputs and services that help form a better society, from cleaner air to a digital economy that turns private data not into corporate profits, but into a resource to generate higher quality public services. The process of creating public value is as important as the final output, which ideally would be a result of a dynamic dialogue with civil society through new forms of collaboration between public, private, and voluntary sector organizations and movements at the city, regional, and national level. When mission-driven public sector actors collaborate to tackle large-scale problems, they co-create new markets affecting both the rate of growth and its direction. But co-creating value and directing growth requires experimentation, exploration, and trial and error. And this is why the fixing framework is so misguided. It makes public sector agencies feel like backseat players and renders them more risk-averse, fearing that a failed project might become front-page news. And yet, when successes do happen, such as the investments in the digital technologies, including Google's algorithm, or new forms of energy or the early stages of biotechnology, they are interpreted as private successes. While market fundamentalists heaped criticism on the U.S. government for funding the solar startup Solyndra, which eventually failed, they never mentioned the fact that the Tesla S received roughly the same amount of public support. In the 21st century, the debate about growth must become more about its direction and the underlying organizational capacity required to welcome the risk-taking and experimentation needed by all organizations involved. Through this change of mindset, the progressive agenda can be reawakened. It can and should make all actors feel like they are in the driving seat, co-creating value, but also distributing it in more inclusive ways, making it more difficult for a narrow group of self-acclaimed wealth creators to extract value that is created collectively. What is needed is a new dynamic conversation within society on which missions are so vital to our collective futures that we can't afford not to bet on them together. That is the aim of this book. As a matter of fact, capitalist economy is not and cannot be stationary, nor is it merely expanding in a steady manner. It is incessantly being revolutionized from within by new enterprise, i.e., by the intrusion of new commodities or new methods of production or new commercial opportunities into the industrial structure as it exists at any moment. Joseph Schumpeter. Businessmen have a different set of delusions from politicians and need, therefore, different handling. They are, however, much milder than politicians, at the same time allured and terrified by the glare of publicity, easily persuaded to be patriots, perplexed, bemused, indeed terrified, yet only too anxious to take a cheerful view, vain, perhaps, but very unsure of themselves, pathetically responsive to a kind word. You could do anything you liked with them if you would treat them, even the big ones, not as wolves or tigers, but as domestic animals by nature, even though they have been badly brought up and not trained as you would wish. It is a mistake to think that they are more immoral than politicians. If you work them into the surly, obstinate, terrified mood of which domestic animals, wrongly handled, are so capable, the nation's burdens will not get carried to market, and in the end, public opinion will veer their way. John Maynard Keynes. It is a popular error that bureaucracy is less flexible than private enterprise. It may be so in detail, but when large-scale adaptations have to be made, central control is far more flexible. It may take 2 months to get an answer to a letter from a government department, but it takes 20 years for an industry under private enterprise to readjust itself to a fall in demand. Joan Robinson. Where were you guys, venture capitalists, in the 50s and 60s when all the funding had to be done in the basic science? Most of the discoveries that have fueled the industry were created back then. Paul Berg, 1980 Nobel Prize in Chemistry winner. Introduction. Thinking Big Again. Across the globe, countries, including in the developing world, look to emulate the success of the U.S. economy. In doing so, they look at the power of market-driven mechanisms versus what might seem like old-style state-driven mechanisms in places like Europe or the ex-Soviet Union. But the United States is not what it seems. The preacher of the small state free market doctrine has for decades been directing large public investment programs in technology and innovation that underlie its past and current economic success. From the internet to biotech and even shale gas, the U.S. state has been the key driver of innovation-led growth, willing to invest in the most uncertain phase of the innovation cycle and let business hop on for the easier ride down the way. If the rest of the world wants to emulate the U.S. model, they should do as the United States actually did, not as it says it did. More state, not less. A key part of this lesson should be to learn how to organize, direct, and evaluate state investments so that they can be strategic, flexible, and mission-oriented. Only in this way will top minds find an honor to work for the state. This is something that needs to be understood not only by the rest of the world, but in the United States itself, where the dominant political narrative is endangering funding for future innovation and economic growth. In 2013, U.S. government spending for basic research fell below what it was a decade earlier and will most likely continue to fall due to congressional gridlock over the public budget. Rather than static discussions over the size of the deficit, there must be more debate about its actual composition. How to invest strategically in key areas such as research and development, R&D, education and human capital formation, that will increase gross domestic product, GDP, in the future, bringing the debt to GDP ratio down as a consequence. And how to engage in a debate about the direction of change so that such investments will lead to growth that is not only smarter, innovation-led, but also more inclusive and sustainable. These issues are urgent with the upcoming 2016 U.S. presidential election, which could, if properly informed, change the parameters of the current static debate. The United States desperately needs politicians with the courage to swim against the tide of popular rhetoric and outline a bolder vision for the state's dynamic role in fostering the economic growth of the future. In emerging economies such as China, the public sector is indeed investing billions in new green technologies, with the expectation that these industries will be the engines of future growth. The United States could take inspiration from its own history. In 1961, an American president set out a bold, ambitious, and risky vision to send a man to the moon. Who will have the courage to set out a new vision for America today? Addressing today's societal challenges, for example, those around climate change, require a vision, a mission, and, most of all, confidence about what the state's role in the economy is. As eloquently argued by Keynes in The End of Laissez-Faire, the important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already, and to do them a little better or a little worse, but to do those things which at present are not done at all. This, however, requires the public sector to have vision and confidence, increasingly missing today. Why? A discursive battle. What is the role of the public sector in economic growth? After the financial crisis, with public budgets bloated, mainly due to their role in saving the private sector, across the globe we are hearing that in order for nations to be competitive, innovative, and dynamic, we must have more market and less state. At best, we are told governments merely facilitate the economic dynamism of the private sector. At worst, their lumbering, heavy-handed, and bureaucratic institutions actively inhibit it. The fast-moving, risk-loving, and pioneering private sector, by contrast, is what really drives the type of innovation that creates economic growth. According to this view, the secret behind an engine of innovation like Silicon Valley lies in its entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. The state can intervene in the economy, but only to fix market failures or level the playing field. It can regulate the private sector in order to account for the external cost companies may impose on the public, such as pollution, and it can invest in public goods such as basic scientific research or the development of drugs with little market potential. To some on the political right, even fixing market failures would be a sin because such attempts would lead to a worse outcome in the form of government failures. What all these views have in common is the assumption that the state should stick to fixing markets, not directly trying to create and shape them. A 2012 Economist article on the future of manufacturing encapsulated this common conception. Governments have always been lousy at picking winners, and they are likely to become more so as legions of entrepreneurs and tinkerers swap designs online, turn them into products at home, and market them globally from a garage, the article stated. As the revolution rages, government should stick to the basics: better schools for a skilled workforce, clear rules, and a level playing field for enterprises of all kinds. Leave the rest to the revolutionaries. This book is committed to dismantling this false image, which underpins a global trend, promoted by conservative economists, politicians, and the media, of bashing and diminishing the importance of the state. It focuses on what Tony Judt calls a discursive battle. How we talk about the state matters, depicting private business as the innovative force while the state is cast as the inertial one, necessary for the basics but too large and heavy to be the dynamic engine, is a description that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we continue to depict the state as only a facilitator and administrator and tell it to stop dreaming, in the end, that is what we get, and ironically, it also then becomes easier to criticize it for being lame and inefficient. The book argues that the fabricated image of a lazy state and a dynamic private sector is one that has allowed some agents in the economy to describe themselves as the wealth creators, and in doing so, extract an enormous amount of value from the economy in the name of innovation. Indeed, the biggest fall in capital gains tax in U.S. history happened at the end of the 1970s, when the National Venture Capital Association managed to succeed in their lobbying for a 50% fall, from 40 to 20% in just 5 years. All on the back of a narrative of the venture capitalists being the true entrepreneurs and risk takers, a story we will see is far from the truth. This biased storyline, describing some actors in the economy as the true innovators, wealth creators, and risk takers, and the others, including the state, as wealth extractors or just distributors, is hurting the possibility of building dynamic and interesting public-private partnerships today. To put it bluntly, this fabricated story hurts innovation and increases inequality, and the problem goes beyond innovation. The story has been used to downsize the state through an increased number of public activities being outsourced to the more dynamic and efficient private sector, chopping away at the very brains of the state, with fewer and fewer resources aimed at building its own internal competencies and capabilities, and reducing what was once a wholesome notion of public value as something to aspire to into a narrow notion of public good, used only to delineate the narrow areas that merit some government intervention, for example, infrastructure, etc. Thinking big. This conventional view of a boring, lethargic state versus a dynamic private sector is as wrong as it is widespread. The book concentrates on telling a very different story in countries that owe their growth to innovation and in regions within those countries like Silicon Valley. The state has historically served not just as an administrator and regulator of the wealth creation process, but a key actor in it, and often a more daring one, willing to take the risks that businesses won't. This has been true not only in the narrow areas that economists call public goods, like funding of basic research, but across the entire innovation chain, from basic research to applied research, commercialization, and early-stage financing of companies themselves. Such investments, yes, governments invest, not only spend, have proved transformative, creating entirely new markets and sectors, including the Internet, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and clean energy. In other words, the state has been key to creating and shaping markets, not only fixing them. Indeed, as is described in one of the longest chapters of the book, Chapter 5, every technology that makes the iPhone smart and not stupid owes its funding to both basic and applied research funded by the state. This, of course, does not mean that Steve Jobs and his team were not crucial to Apple's success, but that ignoring the public side of that story will prevent future Apples from being born. Transformational public investments were often fruits of mission-oriented policies aimed at thinking big, going to the moon or fighting climate change. Getting governments to think big again about innovation is not just about throwing more taxpayer money at more activities. It requires fundamentally reconsidering the traditional role of the state in the economy. In the remainder of this introduction, I delineate what this entails. First, it means empowering governments to envision a direction for technological change and invest in that direction. Creating markets, not only fixing them. Different from narrow attempts to identify and pick winners, envisioning a direction for economic development and technical change broadens the technological opportunity landscape and requires that the state creates a network of willing, not necessarily winning, agents that are keen to seize this opportunity through public-private partnerships. Second, it means abandoning the short-sighted way public spending is usually evaluated. Public investment should be measured by its courage in pushing markets into new areas, rather than the usual assumption of an existing market that the public and private actors must bump elbows in, one crowding out the other. Third, it means allowing public organizations to experiment, learn, and even fail. Fourth, precisely because failure is part of the trial and error process of trying to push markets into new areas, it means figuring out ways for governments and taxpayers to reap some of the rewards from the upside.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?